Hi everyone. Welcome to my very first online study session. Thanks for coming. Good to see you all. Hope you're having a nice Wednesday evening. Just for entertainment's sake, as people get going, here's my kitty. His name is Pinky. Okay, so feel free to type some questions in the chat, and I will be happy to answer them for you. I have two cats, Ritvik. I have Pinky and Penny, but Penny is very shy, and she probably won't come out tonight. But she's very pretty. She's a pastel calico. It's Pinky's sister. I'll try to show a picture sometime. Maybe I should post them on my site. Thanks, Diksha. Can nicotine cause lung cancer? Good question. Not directly, no. It's the carcinogens in the tar of the cigarettes that do that. Nicotine is a stimulant, so it does things like raise your blood pressure and damage those blood vessels, so it builds up the atherosclerosis. So the problem is that people, the nicotine will actually cause the atherosclerosis and the progression of heart disease. So even if you're not smoking cigarettes, that can be a problem. I just watched a really interesting video about a new kind of e-cigarette called Juuls. You've probably heard about them on campus. And those do have nicotine in them, so that's a problem. But smoking is going to contain different chemicals in the tar, so those chemicals are carcinogenic and will cause cancer potentially. But a lot of people actually die of heart disease who are smokers, not necessarily cancer, because cancer takes quite a while to develop. Good question. So remember, there's a lot of effects. A little tip for the test. There's a lot of effects of smoking, so you're going to want to be able to describe some of the different ones, right? Using all that terminology, things like bronchitis and the cancer and the connection to heart disease, carbon monoxide, right? There's a whole bunch of them. So make sure you review those and you can use all the vocab terms. Hi, Eric. Hi, Kanal, Anshul, Jerry, Akash. Great to see you guys. Examples of autoimmune disease. Let's see. Yeah, there's a lot of really common ones. I know people who have lupus, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease. Unfortunately, there's quite a few. There's a lot more obscure ones. Those are kind of the ones that jump to mind. Some of them we'll hit again in class. Multiple sclerosis we'll talk about briefly when we get to the nervous system, because that affects the nerves that go to your muscles. So people with multiple sclerosis sometimes have trouble moving. They sometimes end up in a wheelchair, but not always. Sometimes they just have a lot of trouble using their muscles and doing different things. Crohn's disease is your intestines, so they get a lot of nasty, intestinal problems when they eat. Rheumatoid arthritis gets in your joints. What was the other one I mentioned? Lupus is a whole bunch of different things. I had a student diagnosed with lupus a year or two ago. So some of them can occur when you're quite young. And unfortunately, they never go away. There's no cure. But they can be managed with various medications and stress management and all kinds of things like that. So just as a reminder, some things that students struggle with on the test, definitely the question about smoking. There's a question about some of the different disorders in the respiratory system. People tend to struggle with that. What else? A couple on immunity. So make sure you're clear on community immunity and vaccines, and can use all the terms that go with that, the different immune responses and that sort of thing. Trying to think what else. Sometimes basic stuff. Just make sure you know that the sequence that air goes through the, through the airway, and that, blood goes through your hearts. Even just those basics. Make sure you can write it out. Okay, got a couple more questions coming in. Difference between HIV and AIDS, good question. So HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus, and that's the virus that causes AIDS. AIDS is the disease, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, you get when you actually have symptoms, meaning enough of your T cells have been killed that you can no longer have a good immune response, and you start getting all kinds of weird diseases and cancers and things. So a person can be HIV positive, have the virus in their body, and not actually be sick with AIDS. And that's happening more and more as we have medications that sort of stop the progression to people actually getting sick with AIDS. Question about how does lymph help remove pathogens from the body? So lymph is actually just the fluid. It's like saying blood. It's kind of more important what's in the lymph. So in the lymph is a whole bunch of white blood cells, and they're the things that actually are going to be attacking the pathogens, right? Because they're going to recognize that they are pathogens and attack them either in the lymphatic system, or they can send the white blood cells out into your bloodstream, right? And if they have a specific immune response, they can send antibodies out into the bloodstream. How does the killer T cell differentiate from white blood cells? I think you mean like kind of in general. So, at the level of this class, if you get the idea that those hemopoietic stem cells in your bone marrow, that they differentiate, good word, into the different kinds of white blood cells, and one of them is eventually the killer T cells. I have to say, I don't know a lot about that specific process, but I'm sure there are genetic instructions within those cells, just like in any other kind of specialized cell, that say, you're going to be a T cell, these are the proteins you need to make, and this is where you're going to go and what you're going to do. So, but I don't know a whole lot other than that. So again, for the purposes of this class, as long as you understand that they do differentiate from these original stem cells that become all the kinds of blood cells, that's really sufficient. Let's see, superior and inferior vena cava are on the right side of the heart. So why are they a part of systemic and not pulmonary? Okay, so the right and left side of the heart have more to do with the blood being oxygenated or deoxygenated. So the blood coming into the right side of the heart is deoxygenated, so it's coming in from systemic circulation. It leaves through the pulmonary artery and then becomes pulmonary circulation. So the right side of the heart is incoming blood from systemic, outgoing through pulmonary circulation, so it's pumping the blood through pulmonary circulation. Similarly, on the left side of the heart is oxygenated blood coming back from pulmonary circulation, and then the left ventricle is pumping the blood through systemic circulation, through the aorta. Okay, so I wouldn't associate the sides of the heart with circulation so much. The sides of the heart have more to do with separating the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Hi, Tanisha. No, there's no short answer questions. There's just a whole bunch of completion. So there's nothing where you have to really explain anything in detail. There are a number of questions with sort of explanations where you're filling terms in. So almost all the things you're writing are going to be specific terms, okay? And they should all be mostly things on your vocab list. There's a few from earlier in the year, so just be prepared with the words that we've been using throughout this unit. Where does the coronary artery branch off of? Thanks, Anshul. Off the aorta. So if you think about it, you'd want it to be pretty close to the heart, right? So my understanding, and I haven't really seen a great picture of this, but my understanding is that as soon as the blood comes out the aorta from the heart, that there must be a small vessel that comes off, that's the coronary artery, and that sends that blood then back into the coronary circulation system. So I think it's right off the first part of the aorta. Canal, how do white blood cells get oxygen? Oh, that's an interesting question. I have to think about that one for a second. Because normally the blood brings it to the cells. I would like to think, since they're floating in the blood for the most part, that they could somehow get it from the blood. I don't know how much cellular respiration white blood cells actually do. I would imagine if they're in a lymphoid organ, then there would be capillaries going to that organ just like everywhere else in your body. If they're actually actively floating through your blood, Not sure. I don't know if maybe they don't use very much or if they can somehow get it right from the red blood cells in the blood. That's a really interesting question. Thanks. What two structures in the fetal heart allow blood to bypass the lungs? Thanks, Shannon. That's a really interesting thing called fetal circulation that I've taught in the past, and I don't anymore. So please let me know if I somehow left that on the unit guide or something. What it is, though, is a hole in the heart called the foramen ovale between the two sides of the heart, and then another thing, that ductus arteriosus, that connects the pulmonary artery and the aorta, and all that lets the blood go like straight into systemic circulation, and most of it doesn't go to the lungs in a fetus because it doesn't need to. Right? So it's kind of a neat system that changes right when you're born. But it's something I've cut out of our curriculum this year, so you don't need to worry about it. And that takes care of Akash's question too. That's the ductus arteriosus and the foramen ovale. They might have been on one of the review sheets that were older, and I haven't changed them yet. But again, it's something that I think is interesting, but kind of wasn't essential, so I've cut it out of the unit. Akash, no, again, there's not a CER on the quiz, no other open-ended things. Okay, just the completion questions. DT, if red blood cells do not contain nuclei or organelles, are they non-living? You know, we don't think of it that way because, you know, the organism, you are alive, right? Yes, individual cells are alive. I mean, they're living in the sense that there's stuff going on in there. I think they can actually do some lactic acid fermentation. I'm not sure about that, but they don't really need to because they're just transporting. All they have to do is float through your bloodstream. They don't really have to do that much. So they're really just a container for all that hemoglobin. So, you know, I don't know. If you put it in a dish, I'm not sure how long it would last because it can't make a lot of ATP, but it is certainly part of a living organism. You know, you can get all philosophical about what's actually alive, right? We're going to let that go for now. Hey, Alay, glad you could come on. Yeah, and Alay is on here as a moderator, so he can answer simple questions. He can let me know if there's anything going on, hold any comments. So thanks, Alay, for taking some time to do that. And we really appreciate your help in class, too. Okay, you're welcome, Akash. Anshul, how do red blood cells perform cellular respiration if they don't have any organelles? My understanding is that they don't. Again, I think they do a little bit of lactic acid fermentation, but don't have much need for energy. Is there any difference in function between T and B cells? From Alicia. Thanks, Alicia. Yes, very much so. Again, it's a little beyond the scope of this class, but just in a little bit of time, B cells are the ones that make antibodies. Okay, T cells don't make antibodies. There's a couple types of T cells. Some of the T cells are the ones that can kill other cells directly, aptly named killer T cells. And then some of them are one's called helper T cells, which help to activate the B cells, help to activate the killer T cells. That's why they're so critical when those T cells are infected by HIV. But again, that's a little bit more advanced. We're not going to get into that too much in this class. If you take a more advanced bio class, they'll, believe me, get a bunch of the immune cells in there, and you'll be going crazy trying to keep track of it all. Okay, but basically they're just different types of immune cells that have slightly different functions. Antibodies versus direct killing. So remember I mentioned how you'd want to kill both the cells that are infected, that's the killer T cell's job, as well as any pathogens floating in your blood. And the B cells create antibodies that do that part. Hi, Pallavi. Just to clarify, the placenta is formed by the fetus's stem cells. Yes. So before it's a fetus, right, when the zygote first forms, which is the fertilized egg, the zygote starts to divide, and you get like a cluster of a couple hundred cells called a blastocyst. And I think I showed you a picture of this during genetics. And, you know, part of that little blastocyst develops into the placenta, and part of it develops into the fetus. And yes, that's sort of all embryonic stem cells. Or the embryonic stem cells are the ones that become the fetus rather than the placenta. So, sort of. Why doesn't a fetus's lungs need so much oxygen? Because there's no air going into the fetus's lungs. The fetus is getting its oxygen directly from the blood coming from the placenta, which is, of course, going through the umbilical vein. So it's getting oxygen through its incoming blood, and it doesn't breathe. So having blood go to the lungs to get oxygen wouldn't be very helpful. Okay, so they just need a tiny little bit, actually, to keep the tissue alive and help the lung tissue to develop in the fetus. Thanks, Telemetrics. Appreciate that question. Hi, Rivik. For clarification, our bone marrow produces adult stem cells that differentiate into white blood cells. I guess I would I would probably phrase it a little differently. I would probably say the adult stem cells are in the bone marrow because I think they're always there. But constantly those adult stem cells, which are hemopoietic stem cells, are differentiating into all the kinds of blood cells. So they can differentiate into 5 or 6 kinds of white blood cells, red blood cells, the cells that break up and become platelets, like all of that happens in there. So, you know, the easiest way to think about it is all blood cells, right? And, but they're sort of in there, I think, I would assume from the time that you're an embryo. So I don't know, I would say it produces, but they're constantly dividing. The stem cells are constantly dividing. Gian, why do we need to recycle red blood cells? I think primarily to get the iron from the hemoglobin. My understanding is that the rest of the red blood cells are just, you know, recycled, gotten rid of as waste, just like all your other dead cells, but that the hemoglobin is broken down and to keep the, in order to keep that iron and put it into other hemoglobin molecules. Tina's asking, when you're oxygen deprived, doesn't your blood pH stay the same when you're oxygen deprived? Well, it depends what's happening with your carbon dioxide. So remember, it's not oxygen that influences your blood pH, it's carbon dioxide. So that's a hard question to answer. It depends why you're oxygen deprived. If you're oxygen deprived because you're holding your breath or you're suffocating, your cells are still producing carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. So actually, that carbon dioxide will build up in your blood because you're not breathing out if we assume you're holding your breath or suffocating, right? And therefore, your blood is going to become more acidic. The pH will decrease, okay? Now, if there's some reason that you're oxygen deprived, as on an airplane, but that's lost its oxygen, but you are able to breathe out, then your blood pH would stay the same. So the change in blood pH has to do with carbon dioxide, not oxygen. Okay, so that's the really critical thing, is to realize that blood pH and therefore breathing is regulated by the carbon dioxide, not by the oxygen. Okay, Anshul is asking, what happens if plaque develops in arteries that supply oxygen to cells in other parts of the body, such as the hands? That's possible. I talked a little bit in class about getting peripheral vascular disease in your legs. I think it occasionally happens in the arms, but I don't think quite so much. Not sure why. I could hazard a guess, but I'll let that go right now. So you could have problems. Like I said, when it's in the legs, I know that people, their legs get sore and it's hard to walk because they aren't getting as much oxygen. And you can actually have the same kinds of surgeries. I didn't mention that in class, but just like you could have a heart bypass, they can do bypasses of the vessels in your legs, right? And therefore be able to restore better blood flow, right? So that's actually one of the treatments for people who have peripheral vascular disease. It's my kitty's tail, sorry. Okay, hopefully that answered your question. And Diksha, why can we not transplant stem cells that are not a close enough match to the recipient? Okay, so you can tie that into the stuff that we're doing now with immunity. If we put somebody's stem cells into you and they're not a very good match, they're going to have foreign antigens. Your immune system is going to attack them because they're foreign material, right? And that immune response not only will destroy the stem cells that you're trying to put in, but the immune response itself could kill you. It could be a really strong immune response, and it could end up being deadly to you, right? And certainly make you feel very bad. But it would also defeat the purpose because it would destroy the cells that we put in your body. And we call that, when that happens to somebody, we say that they've rejected their transplant, right? Like their immune system has destroyed it. What we typically do with a transplant of an organ is we give the person immunosuppressant drugs that sort of hold down their immune system. And sometimes they're on those drugs for the rest of their lives. But it's a lot better to give them transplant tissue that's a close enough match that it won't trigger their immune system quite so badly. Good questions. Thank you, guys. Oops. Okay, Yash, and I may be falling behind on the questions a bit, but so just bear with me. What are some disorders of the blood and immune system? Oh, that's a big question, Yash. So definitely check your notes a little bit, but when we talk about blood, it could be things like anemia, hemophilia, right? Platelet disorders, anything that affects the blood cells and the function of those blood cells. The immune system disorders are going to be more like your ability to have an immune response. So remember that business about immune tolerance versus immune response. You can have disorders where you have too much immune tolerance, right, and you're not able to fight things off. You could have, and you'd be immunocompromised, we would say. You could have the other direction where your immune system is too active, and you could have allergies, potentially deadly, or autoimmune disease, right? So those would be some things that could happen in the immune system. Jerry asks, how would the body deal with the excess fluid after the lymph nodes are removed? Well, sometimes it doesn't. So remember I said that when a person's lymph nodes are removed, that sometimes their limbs get very swollen. So you're not so good at it, basically. Ideally, they didn't remove all of them. You have actually like a pretty big cluster. I know when my mom had hers removed, she had like 20-something removed. And I don't know if that was all of them or most of them or what. But you have, a number. So hopefully it's not so bad that they have to remove them all, and you'll have some ability to deal with that. But you're just going to get a lot of swelling of fluid and a little bit more. There's a lot higher risk of having infection in those limbs as well. And you can imagine that's because you don't have the lymph node to sort of filter out those pathogens coming in. Raghu asks, are T and B cells produced in different areas, or are they the same cell that differentiates? Well, they both differentiate from the hemopoietic stem cells in your bone marrow, but where they mature or develop is different. So the T cells are named for the fact that they mature in the thymus. The B cells are named for the fact that they mature in the bone marrow. They don't stay there forever. Some of those B cells actually go to places like your spleen. Okay, so they can travel around, but then they're named for where they sort of mature. Aditya, does the fetus produce urea? And if it does, how does it dispose of it? Excellent question. So normally your kidney would filter out the urea, right, and put it in your urine. But of course, that wouldn't be good for a fetus because the urine becomes part of its amniotic fluid, and that would not be a good thing. So what happens is the kidneys work a little differently right before birth, and the urea is actually sent to the umbilical, let me get this right, arteries, right? So the urea will go back to the placenta. It will diffuse across the placenta into the mother's blood. The mother has kidneys, of course, and her kidneys will filter this extra urea out of the blood and put it into her urine. Okay? And to me, the really fascinating thing is literally in the minutes after you're born, all of this stuff switches back, or I shouldn't say switches back, switches from the fetal system to the organism, or sort of, I wouldn't say adult, but sort of the child's system, right? So the kidney has to switch and start putting urea in its own urine, right? The blood has to start flowing as it would in a person that's already been born, right? So there's all kinds of changes that happen with birth that change all these special systems for a fetus. Thank you for Pinky for walking across the screen. Appreciate that. Okay. I think you all get a nice view of Pinky's butt there. Okay. Lillian says, just to check, umbilical vein carries blood that goes to the mom, the baby, and the umbilical artery carries blood that goes from baby to mom. Okay. Well, that is sort of true, but sort of not true, okay? The reason I'm going to say it's not true is there is no blood that goes from baby to mom, ever. No blood that goes from mom to baby, no blood that goes from baby to mom. Hint for the quiz tomorrow, don't say that blood goes to mom, okay? It doesn't go to mom, it goes to the placenta, okay? So the better words to use, you've got the directions right. The umbilical vein is carrying blood in to the fetus, okay? The umbilical artery is carrying it away, okay? Memory trick, arteries away. But you're going to want to talk about the fetus and the placenta. That's where the blood is going, between the fetus and the placenta, not between baby and mom. Let's see, Sathvika. Are platelets considered cells? Now, platelets are really weird. I've seen them referred to as cell fragments. I'm not even quite sure what that means. I don't really have a good vision of what they're made of. I don't know that they have a membrane or anything like that, because all I've ever heard them referred to as cell fragments. Kind of one of those things in the back of my mind I've been meaning to look up for a while, but all I know is that when the stem cells differentiate, they turn into some kind of giant cell. I believe it's called a megakaryocyte, and then that breaks up into these fragments. Again, I'm not quite sure what these fragments are made of. I don't think they have to do a lot of, there is some function involved. I mean, they have to be able to sense that there's a broken blood vessel and stick to it somehow, and then they do send signals to start the cascade for blood clotting. So there's some functionality, but it's my understanding that it's not like an entire cell at all. So that's one of those things I should look up at some point, and just so I have a better picture in my mind of how that actually can be functional without being a cell. That's an interesting question. I should make a list of these interesting questions. Platelets, what are they? I'm going to make a little list here, but I won't look it up right now. Okay, so Mira, lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell, but do they produce multiple types of antibodies or just one? Okay, so lymphocytes is a general term for sort of all white blood cells. The type that produces antibodies, as we mentioned before, is the B cells. They differentiate into something called plasma cells, and then the plasma cells pump out a whole bunch of these antibodies, which remember are just proteins. They're just doing a whole lot of protein synthesis. So there are many kinds of antibodies, as we mentioned, like literally potential for tens of thousands. So that means you have a potential for tens of thousands of B cells, right? And so remember that the reason the immune response, the specific immune response, takes so long is that you have to, go back and find the right B cell that can make the right kind of antibody for that particular pathogen. And that takes a while. So what you have is the sort of capacity. You have many kinds of lymphocytes. One of those kinds is B cells, and then you have the capacity to make many kinds of B cells, which could produce many kinds of antibodies. Whew, hope that was clear. Okay, so Tina is clarifying her question about the oxygen here. She said, I'm sorry, I'm in environments like airplanes. Wouldn't the blood pH decrease as well because cells perform fermentation, which produces lactic acid? Maybe a little bit, but I don't think there's nearly as much lactic acid as there is cells still doing carbon dioxide. Remember that you don't go from, you still have a lot of oxygen in your blood for quite a while. Even if you're not getting as much in the air, you've got kind of a reserve of oxygen in your blood for a while, so your cells are still doing plenty of cellular respiration for a while. They way prefer to do cellular respiration. In fact, not all cells can do lactic acid fermentation, only some of them. So you're still pumping out plenty of carbon dioxide. So in that sense, so on an airplane, actually you would have both, right? You'd have the buildup of carbon dioxide and plus potentially a buildup of lactic acid. So actually they would contribute to the same decrease in pH anyway. For coronary bypass, where does the artery come from? There's a couple different places. I may not be totally up to date on this, but the two that I'm aware of are that they take them from a vein in your leg and sometimes from a mammary one, right, that's in the chest. And I'm not even sure. I think they can be veins, not even arteries. I should check that. I'm not sure about that. But it is another vessel. I know either from the leg or the chest typically. I'm not sure which one at this moment. I used to know that. Ritvik says, why can a very strong immune system kill someone? Very good question. So there's a number of things that happen, and because this is part of why you feel so lousy when you get sick or sometimes when you get a vaccine. It causes a lot of inflammation in your body, like pretty severe inflammation. It can cause swelling. So if you want a dramatic vision of this, I don't know if you guys know what anaphylactic shock is. When somebody gets a really life-threatening allergic reaction, like when they've been, stung by a bee and they have a terrible allergy or something like that, and their throat swells up and they get hives all over their body and their heart rate changes. These kinds of things can kill you. I think what often ends up killing people in an acute anaphylactic shock situation is that their throat swells up and they can't breathe. I think that's one of the most common things that actually kills somebody. But the inflammation is going to impact the functioning of you just get fluid pouring everywhere. Fluid gets in your lungs. It can be quite dramatic, and this can happen slower or faster, but it can eventually be deadly or quickly be deadly. Does vaping also use tar, which can cause lung cancer? Not tar specifically. So this is where it gets a little weird, right? Cigarettes have tar, which contains carcinogens, right, which can cause lung cancer. Vaping doesn't have tar because tar is a byproduct of burning the tobacco, but the vaping fluid has other chemicals. Most of them contain propylene glycol, which is nasty in itself. And then they contain a bunch of these flavoring fluids that give it all that fancy smell and flavor and stuff. And those contain a bunch of chemicals that we're kind of not sure what they do. But some of them are associated with both respiratory problems, some hormonal problems, probably some things, frankly, that we haven't figured out yet because they're pretty new. So no, they don't contain tar, which would cause cancer, but I would say we cannot say that those things are safe. Those chemicals are still going to get into your lungs and cause some kind of unknown problems. Where there'll be a word bank for the matching from Ritvik. So there's not matching, it's all fill-in-the-blank completion. And no, there's not a word bank. So it's pretty strongly implied in the questions, but you will need to write them from out of your head. So you're going to need to be comfortable using the words out of your head for things. So just sort of think about that as you study. Excuse me. What are histamines from a DT? Histamines are these chemicals, I think I'm not sure if it's a protein, but it's a chemical that's put out by mast cells, which are a type of immune cell. And those are the chemicals that are put out when we have an allergy or even like a cold or something. And they make us all stuffy, make all this mucus, and create like the red eyes, the itchy eyes, and all that we get when we have allergies. And that's why people take antihistamines. It literally just neutralizes that chemical that causes all these allergic effects, right? So that it makes us feel better. It doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't stop the immune response. I guess it does in a way. It sort of mitigates the immune response because it reduces the histamine chemical that's causing a lot of the symptoms. Oofmaster says hi. I don't know who you are, Oofmaster, but hi back. Does the systemic circulation take oxygenated blood to the cells of the lungs? You know, I don't know the answer to that for sure. My feeling is there's already all these capillaries in your lungs from pulmonary circulation, and I would think that oxygen could diffuse right from those capillaries into the cells of your lungs. That would make sense to me. I don't see any reason why you'd have a whole other set of capillaries coming from somewhere else. I haven't ever heard that. So I think that the pulmonary circulation, the capillaries that are already near all your alveoli, and that means they're entwined in all your lung tissue, I think those are already taking care of that need. I'm not actually totally sure of that, but I'm fairly confident of that answer. Okay, Gian says, what immune functions is the spleen involved in? I think multiple. Sort of the easiest that jumped to my mind is that there's cells there called macrophages, which are called the first responders. Macrophages means they can eat up things, and so they're sort of first responders that can come out as soon as you have a problem and start eating up pathogens, and that's part of it's a more non-specific response. But they also have a lot of the B cells and stuff, so that as they get a message that this is the pathogen we're looking for, that the B cells in there can start pumping out the antibodies. And so some of the cells live there all the time. Some of the cells can leave when you have a problem, right? Plus the spleen is a lymphoid organ, so the lymph is constantly flowing through it, and it could be filtering the lymph and attacking pathogens that are coming in the lymph as well. So some of these big organs, they're doing a bunch of things at once. Diksha asks for the quiz, will we need to know vocabulary from circulatory, respiratory, and lymphatic system? Will we also have to brush up on the vocab from cell biology? Certainly as it's relevant to this unit. I mean, I hope you've seen that we've used a ton of cell biology, right? So if it's terminology that we've used to explain things in those systems, yep, you better be prepared for that, right? But it's not going to be anything we haven't talked about in the last few weeks, right? I mean, we've kind of been using that terminology pretty steadily in these last few weeks. Yash says, what is the function of salts and dissolved gases in the blood plasma? Let me start with the dissolved gases. So dissolved gases refers to oxygen and carbon dioxide. I don't know if I would say they have a function. They're being carried there, right? So remember that gases can dissolve in liquid, just like in the ocean. Dissolved carbon dioxide is how most of the carbon dioxide is carried. I think there actually is a little bit in the hemoglobin, but it's not that important. Most of the carbon dioxide that's in our blood is dissolved in the plasma of the blood. For oxygen, there is a little bit dissolved in our blood, but it's not nearly enough to support the oxygen level we need for the kind of cellular respiration we do. And that's why we have hemoglobin, right? The evolution of hemoglobin allowed for us to carry many, many, many times more oxygen in our blood, and therefore be able to do a lot more cellular respiration and have a lot more energy. The salts, we have to transport a lot of salts. We use salts and electrolytes, things like sodium ions and chloride ions and potassium ions for a bunch of functions, most obviously having to do with transporting nerve signals, nerve impulses. We'll talk about that more later, and for muscle contraction. So you use a lot of ions for things like that. So as you eat them in your food and they're transported in your blood to different cells, they're going to get used in those ways. I don't know that they necessarily have a function in your blood. They kind of do, actually. I just thought of another thing. Your blood has to be in osmotic balance with your tissues, right? So there's always going to be a certain level of salts in your blood to maintain that osmotic balance. If you didn't have the right concentration of solutes in your blood, you would have water kind of rushing in and out between your blood and your tissues. And that already happens a little bit, actually. But your kidneys are partly responsible for maintaining the right electrolyte balance in your blood as well. And if there's extra salts, they can put those in your urine, conveniently enough. Okay, Oofmaster's back. What are memory cells? What are memory cells when a secondary immune response is stimulated? Where do they come from, and what are they used for later on? Okay, where they came from was your primary immune response. So remember that when you have a primary immune response, that's when you form the memory cells, right? I think some of them continue to circulate in your blood. Some of them might be in the lymphoid organs. I'm not completely sure about that. But the idea is that if you were exposed to that pathogen again, rather than going through the entire process of like finding the right B cell, you sort of already have it there, right? And it's triggered to generate those antibodies in the secondary immune response at, as you know, a greater concentration, faster, so that you have a way more effective secondary immune response and much quicker. Ritvik, could you briefly explain blood clotting, including platelets and fibrinogen to fibrin? Yeah, and again, this is one of those things where we could go into vastly more detail, so I want to kind of try not to. For purposes of this class, I really sort of emphasize the first step of the platelets binding is not the right word, sticking to the blood vessels. My understanding, again, without reminding myself by looking it up, is that the platelets send a signal for some of these other things to happen. And there's a whole cascade of clotting factors. There's literally like 10 steps or something. You could look it up in the physiology book if you're interested. But one of those things that happens is fibrinogen, which is always circulating in your blood, but is not active, is converted to fibrin, right? Fibrin is actively a sticky protein that can clot, okay? So you don't want that in your blood all the time. You need to be very careful and not have, random blood clots forming in your blood, right? So the fibrinogen is activated as part of this whole cascade, and it becomes fibrin. And really all this is, when we say activated, the protein is just changing shape slightly. So it changes shape and becomes fibrin, and it's probably only doing that in a very, very localized area, like right where the blood clot is. And I don't know the exact trigger that makes that happen. Somebody asks, does thrombin count as an enzyme or a hormone that converts fibrinogen into fibrin? Oh, boy. I can't remember. An enzyme is going to make chemical reactions happen. So I don't remember. I don't want to answer that without looking it up. I don't think it's a hormone. It's probably closer to an enzyme. I'm not sure it's technically counted as that. There's another thing called prothrombin, and I think that changes the thrombin, and then thrombin does something to the fibrinogen. So, but again, don't stress over that. It's not it's not something I'm going to test you on. I want you to be aware that there's all these steps for good reason. You don't want your blood to clot that easily. But we're not going to get into the sort of nitty-gritty details of that. Keju says, I'm not sure who that is, does systemic circulation include coronary circulation? No, I don't believe it does. My understanding is that coronary circulation is kind of its own little beast, right? That's an interesting thing. See, this gets into the whole thing of like humans wanting to put things in categories, right? You know how I am about that. Technically, coronary circulation is generated off the aorta. So in that way, yeah, I think technically I would say it is part of systemic circulation, except that it's so special that we almost always talk about it on its own. So we talk about coronary circulation as its own special little system, but I think you could certainly justify that it's part of systemic because it's coming off of the aorta and it's certainly part of your body that's not your lungs. Jerry, what are some examples of enzymes in the blood and what are their functions? Yeah, this one I kind of struggled with because somebody said amylase in class. It was interesting. I said, what would be in the blood? And somebody said amylase. And I'm like, why would there be amylase in the blood? Like, that's a digestive enzyme. And I kind of poo-pooed it. And then I actually looked it up later because I do that sometimes. And there is sometimes amylase in the blood. My understanding, though, from the brief research I did was that it's a problem. Like when your pancreas is kind of overproducing, it can pump some amylase into the blood. But there's no real function for it that I know of because there'd be no reason to have starch in your blood. So I don't know off the top of my head what would be some active enzymes. It might be some of those things related to the blood clotting process. But, I guess the good news is if I can't think of any off the top of my head, you're not going to need to know any, right? So, some of these things is like, my head can only hold so much too, right? It's pretty crowded in there. Okay, Neil, how does fever slow down the growth of pathogens? My understanding, and again, this is something I'm a little vague on, is that for whatever reason, the bacteria are somewhat more sensitive to the heat than our cells. Our cells don't really love it either, but that our cells can continue to function, but it sort of slows down like the reproduction of the bacteria, so that they are, you know, anything you can do to slow them down a little bit means we're more likely to win the war, right? So I don't think I think it just slows them down. And again, it may have sort of a similar effect on some of our cells, but I think we're more able to protect cells and keep different temperatures in different parts of our body even potentially, so that it's not going to be too damaging. If it gets too high, it can be damaging, right? But we can sort of tolerate a slight fever, and it does make us uncomfortable and not feel too good, right? You know that when you have a fever, but it slows down the pathogens enough that we can fight them off more easily. And I don't know exactly why it does that. Mira asks, how do you die from infection? This came up in one of my classes. Must have been a different period than you. We got into a little bit of a discussion about when infection gets really bad, it can become systemic. It's a problem called sepsis, and lots of people do die from sepsis. It's a bloodborne infection. And eventually what happens is you basically have, you know, so many infected cells that they start affecting your normal functioning and they overwhelm your immune system. I think a lot of times people end up dying of organ failure because the infection gets into those organs or the inflammation prevents those organs from functioning. And when you have organ failure, it basically means that vital organs, meaning ones you need pretty much all the time to survive, so we're talking your liver, your kidneys, right, that those organs start to shut down. Sometimes there's also a fluid buildup in places like the lungs in response to infection. So that happens with pneumonia sometimes, where people's lungs fill with fluid that's sort of trying to fight the infection, but you end up actually sort of drowning in your own lung fluid so that you can die from that. How does smoking cause damage to the arteries? It's something about the chemicals. I don't know the exact reaction, but remember that when you smoke, the air isn't just going into your alveoli. And maybe this is something I didn't mention in class that I should be more specific on. It's not just oxygen that can diffuse into your capillaries, right? If you inhale chemicals into your lungs, they can diffuse into your blood too. So these chemicals from the cigarettes, nicotine and other things, are diffusing into your blood and going throughout your body. So some of those chemicals, nicotine being one, and there are probably others, interact with the cells that line your arteries and actually physically damage them. And then that of course, is going to sort of open the window to atherosclerosis. Andrew, what are the differences between red bone marrow and bone marrow, or are they the same thing? The reason you hear the term red bone marrow is because there is another type called yellow bone marrow that has to do with fat. Not something we focus on a lot in this class, but that's why you might hear the term. Okay, I tend to just say bone marrow because most of the time we are talking about red bone marrow. Gian, if B cells are doing protein synthesis to make antibodies, does immune response affect blood pressure because there are more byproducts, urea, in the bloodstream? Oh, interesting connection. Remember that urea is more from broken down. That's an interesting question. I think of it as being more from breaking down excess amino acids. I believe that's done in the liver. I don't know how much your cells can recycle the amino acids that they get from breaking down their own proteins. The antibodies in the blood do eventually get broken down in places like your kidney, I think your kidney or your liver, something like that. They do get broken down. Antibodies don't live in your body indefinitely. They don't die because they're not really alive. They're proteins, but they do get broken down and leave your body after a few weeks or something like that. So in fact, most proteins do. So if you have a lot of extra proteins, you could have more urea, but remember, those amino acids came in the first place from amino acids you already had, right? So I'm not sure exactly how that works. I mean, I'm sure you have a pretty good reserve of amino acids all the time because you're constantly breaking down proteins and building new ones. So if for whatever reason you have more breakdown of amino acids, you would potentially have more urea. The kidney does filter out proteins, so I'm assuming the kidney can maybe convert those to urea. I'm not sure about that. If at any rate, I guess the practical output of your question is if you have more urea, the kidneys will just filter it out. It should be okay if your kidneys are healthy. Mira asks, how does adrenaline, like in EpiPens, help reduce the symptoms of allergic reactions? Excellent question. So just briefly, EpiPens, the epi stands for epinephrine, which is another name for adrenaline. It's kind of like the medical name for adrenaline. So epinephrine means adrenaline. Well, if you think about adrenaline being this acute stress hormone, think about what it does to get you ready to, for fight or flight, right? It increases your heart rate, and it increases the diameter of your airways, right? So that you can get a bunch of air in and you can, have a bunch of blood going to your muscles and have your heart beat faster and be able to respond to the acute stress. So think about it in terms of an allergic reaction. It opens up your airways. And that's the main thing that kills people in acute allergic reaction, is that their airways close. So the main thing it does is it opens up those airways, right, and keeps their blood flowing, and it can temporarily, in fact, your body produces a little bit of adrenaline when you're having an acute allergic reaction, but usually not enough. And so the EpiPen will give you more, and they can give you more at the hospital to open up your airways, and it sort of temporarily diffuses your immune response. That otherwise would just sort of overpower your body. Good question. Neil Polo, how do allergies work? Wow, I think we all wish we understood that better. We know some things about it. We know there are specific types of immune cells that overreact. We don't exactly know why. There's a lot of debate around that. And there's a lot of, I don't think it's very well understood why allergies can come and go, why sometimes they're very severe and sometimes not. But it is this over-response of your immune system. I wish I could tell you a little more about it. There probably is more known than what I'm telling you right now, but that's sort of as much as I know on a surface level, and I do know that there is just still a lot unknown about allergies. That's why we don't really have any good, we certainly don't have a cure, and we frankly don't even really have very good treatments for the most part, because it's just sort of poorly understood. Diksha, how can a healthy person make a full recovery without a transfusion? So that's one of the practice questions, right? So the key idea here is that you're constantly replenishing your blood supply, right? Like, now and 6 months from now, you have different blood, right? You've made new blood cells, you've made new water, new water is in your plasma. You're remaking your blood all the time. And this is actually true of a lot of parts of your body. A lot of you is rebuilt all the time, your bones, your stomach, right? So you're constantly rebuilding blood. So you simply keep rebuilding it. You're going to be pretty weak at first because you're not going to have a high proportion of red blood cells and things like that. But eventually you'll build that back up again. You'll make new hemoglobin. You'll make new red blood cells. You'll make new white blood cells. You'll make new blood proteins, right? And eventually sort of get back to where you started. Lilian asks, are the questions on the test mostly from the vocab list? Well, vocab is vocab. You're going to need to know the terms on the vocab list, but obviously you have to be able to put it in context to be able to answer questions. So what I often advise people is use the vocabulary to answer the questions that are on your unit guide, right? And then you can also see how that vocab is used on the different, reading guides that we've done. The nice thing about the reading guides is I'm basically modeling a lot of sentences for you that show you how we use that terminology, okay? Plus you've got it in the PowerPoint and in the book, but you've got a lot of models for sort of how we use that terminology in context. So you might want to just kind of read over those and practice saying them out of your own mouth so that if you see it in a completion question that you would feel comfortable filling that in. How does the heart cells send blood back? So it's no different than any other part of your body. If I've got blood going in arteries to my legs, it's going to go eventually to the capillaries, to the cells in my legs. Then that blood is going to flow back into the veins in my legs, and that blood will come back to the vena cava, to the heart, right? So it's the same thing in coronary circulation. The coronary artery is going to take the blood to small arteries, arterioles. It's going to go to coronary capillaries, to individual cells. Then that blood will return through venules, coronary veins, and get dumped back in to the right atrium at the top of the vena cava. So it's really no different than capillaries and all the rest of your body. What type of circulation are the chambers of the heart a part of? We just don't really say it that way. We say things like the left ventricle pumps the blood through systemic circulation, right? So I guess when it's in the chamber of the heart, it's sort of returning from one of the systems of circulation and it's being sent out into the other one. So I don't know that it's just a way for us to talk about these two loops that come out of the heart, right? So sometimes it's good just not to overthink all of this terminology, right? It's just a useful way for us to talk about it. And some of the terms are used in one context but don't make much sense outside of that context. Anshul, does amniotic fluid only maintain the correct temperature for the fetus, or does it... Oh, yeah, I hadn't even really thought of temperature because the mother's whole body is a certain temperature. I think because it said something about it being a higher temperature, which was interesting. It's gonna be at the right osmotic level. I don't know that there's a lot of molecules in it that are important. Nothing comes to mind sort of off the top of my head. That doesn't mean that there's nothing else it's doing. Partly there's a physical cushion, right? The baby's kind of floating, so if the mother's bouncing around, the baby's kind of floating in this fluid, and it's all protected that way, right? You wouldn't want it like bopping around, hitting the sides. So, I would say there's sort of a physical protection element. It keeps it moist, right? So that the skin doesn't sort of dry out and all that. So it's going to have some other functions. Again, it's interesting, but I don't know a tremendous amount of technical detail about that. Telmetrics. If my spleen got messed up in a motorcycle crash, would that be bad? Yeah, that would be bad. Don't do that. So the spleen actually commonly gets injured in accidents. You hear about that with car accidents and stuff as well. It's really messy because your spleen is a large organ and it stores a lot of blood. So the main thing that I'm aware of is if you get what's called a ruptured spleen, you get a tremendous amount of internal bleeding, and you could die from that internal bleeding. So that would be kind of the biggest thing. People do have their spleens removed. It's not the end of the world because you have lots of other organs that can do similar functions. But, hey, it's better to keep your spleen if you can. But my understanding is that the main critical thing there is the loss of blood that would come from having a ruptured spleen. So, yeah, be careful out there. Raghav, can allergies disappear or gradually increase? Yes, they come, they go. Well, I don't know why. But yes, some people grow out of their allergies that they have as children. Some people, their allergies increase as they get older. Yeah, sorry, don't know why. What are the functions of the spleen? So that is one of those kind of longer questions, Satvika. If I want to do sort of the 10-second answer, remember that it's got both circulatory function, right, that relates to storing a lot of these blood cells, as I just mentioned, being able to break down red blood cells. So there's a whole bunch of circulatory functions. It's a large organ. And then there's all these lymphatic functions that have to do with the white blood cells being there and being able to filter the lymph and all that. Really nice descriptions of this in the physio books. Your bio book does not have a great description of the spleen. So this is where you're going to need to go. You could try going online, but I think probably you'd find more understandable explanations in those physio books. But you could try a search as well if you could find a website that was not too technical. Sonic, a heart attack is when cholesterol enters a weak artery in the coronary artery, and there is a buildup of plaque. A buildup of other materials results in the formation of plaque. There's a lot of stuff in plaque. Some of it is fats and cholesterol from your blood. And by the way, it's not really a weak artery. It's the arterial lining, which is actually the cells, right? You have these endothelial cells that are the arterial lining of your coronary arteries. So the plaque is able to get started in there. It could be fats from your blood. It also becomes some of your own immune cells because your body does recognize that kind of something's wrong there, and you start to get these immune cells that sort of try to help, but then they sort of get sucked in and become part of the plaque, and they turn into these things called foam cells, and it's a long-term process, but they actually become part of it. So there's a number of things in there. Oofmaster says fats. Not sure why, but I kind of like that name, Oofmaster. It's kind of just fun to say. Hi, Siri. It says if there is a blockage in the artery that takes oxygenated blood to the pacemaker cells, does heart attack and heart attack. Yeah. Yeah, they could happen at the same time. I don't know how often it's because the heart attack is affecting the pacemaker cells directly because they're like way up in the right atrium. But it doesn't have to be in the pacemaker cells. We used to show a nice video in physiology where they were sort of dramatizing this guy having a heart attack, which took a long time. He was at work, they got him to the hospital, and then they showed how some of the cells in the heart, just because they were under stress, started sending out these like distress signals that were electrical signals, and they were messing up the electrical signals of the cells around them. So just the sort of stress and distress that's going on in the heart when you have a heart attack can be enough to disrupt the electrical signals. So you don't have to have the pacemaker cells specifically be messed up to cause fibrillation and cardiac arrest. Okay, so remember that the heart attack itself is more drawn out. If the electrical signals get messed up, it's going to be like a sudden problem within seconds or minutes. That's going to cause the heart to go into fibrillation, stop beating at all, and potentially cause sudden cardiac death. Neil, why does your body... Sorry, I got to find that again. Why does your body create an allergic reaction that can kill you? Because our immune system needs to be really strong, right? The body is not a perfect system. There are lots of things that are good in when they're a little bit, like inflammation, like stress, but when there's a lot of it, it's too much. And I guess the best answer I can give is if your immune system wasn't that strong, it wouldn't be as good at fighting pathogens. And if you think about evolutionarily, a whole lot more people die of infection than die of allergic reactions, right? So it is beneficial for us to have a really strong immune system, even though that's problematic sometimes. When you're researching, what websites do you usually find helpful? It depends what I'm researching. If it's medical stuff, WebMD is nice. There's a couple health something that is good for sort of responses that are written for regular people who are going to the doctor, right? So if I want kind of like that kind of a description, and for you guys, that's probably good. There's actually a really good site. It's kind of a silly name, but there's one called Kids Health that's actually really good. I've gotten stuff off of there, and I've used it in class a couple of times. Really nice descriptions. I think it's for parents looking up about their kids. If I want something more technical, I'll do a search. I am totally fine with Wikipedia. What's nice about Wikipedia is it's usually fairly well written, and it usually has references right on the page. I will tell you, though, Wikipedia is often very technical, especially for sciencey stuff. It is probably so technical that you guys wouldn't understand it most of the time. I get stuck in it sometimes, but it goes to a level where I can kind of get a higher level understanding. But I'll do a Google search first, and I'll look for something that seems like it's about the right level and the right context, right? I think for you guys it's tricky because a lot of things are either going to be out of context or too technical for you. So, but you can try. You know how when you Google it, you get the little brief description, right? If that little brief description is understandable and seems to be in the right context, you could go ahead and use that. But, you know, if even that little blurb is too much, just immediately leave. Like, don't waste your time, right? But also keep in mind, I do often have links that might be helpful. I can't remember if I have a general list of good medical resources. If I don't, WebMD, HealthCom, I want to say. Anyway, there's a few good ones now, and maybe sometime I can put together a list of resources for you guys. That's a great idea. Put that on my list. What happens when blood is diluted and the concentration of red blood cells and clotting factors decrease? You know, you just won't have as many. So part of what happens, for example, with platelets and clotting factors is they have to literally sort of physically, you know, run into the problem. So if you have a lot fewer of them in your blood, for example, if you had fewer platelets in your blood, a lower concentration, you would just have a slower clotting response, right? Because it's going to take a little longer for them to run into the problem because your blood's always moving. So, you know, it's not necessarily like going to be immediately like horrible, but it's going to be less effective at doing whatever that thing does. Lower red blood cells, of course, is one form of anemia because if you have fewer red blood cells, you literally carry less oxygen. So that's a special problem. Anshul asks, do certain enzymes denature when you have a fever due to the increase in body temperature? I think that can happen. I think some of them are less effective. Remember that enzymes do have a range, and you know, a fever is not that much, right? It's really just a few degrees. So it might change their effectiveness a little bit. Some of them within a short range actually can increase because you're going to increase the collisions of molecules with that enzyme. So it depends how much the increase is and how sensitive that particular enzyme is. How do molecules, cells, etc. move through the lymphatic system? Lymph is a fluid, so they're flowing just like blood. It's hard for us to picture because we're just not used to thinking of having this other fluid flowing through us. But it's flowing through vessels just like blood. So it's going to be a lot of water, and it's not pumped. It's moving with less pressure, but because water is constantly entering your lymph, it's sort of moving with the pressure of the fluid behind it, and then it's moving through your lymphatic system. So it's just sort of moving along as the lymph behind it is formed, and then it's kind of more of a one-way system. It comes from your tissues, and the fluid gets dumped into your vena cava to get that water back into your bloodstream. So I think it's just moving along with the flowing lymph. Diksha asks, why is water not infused into a person after they lose blood? Okay, so go back to the idea of osmosis, right? If you put red blood cells in water, and there's beautiful pictures of this in your textbook, right? If you put red blood cells in water, they're going to be way more concentrated than the water, right? So water is going to flow into those red blood cells and cause them to burst. So if I injected water into a person's veins, there's a whole lot of cells in there, right? And I'm going to change that osmotic balance, potentially cause those cells to burst. What is in the urea and how are they made? Okay, so remember that urea is, it's a fairly simple molecule, which I don't remember the exact composition of, but it's a nitrogen molecule, and it's coming from breaking down amino acids. So remember the amino acids have that amino end, right? It's one of the few just nitrogen nucleotides and proteins are the only ones that have nitrogen. So when you break down amino acids, you get that nitrogen. And nitrogen, if you think of something like ammonia, isn't that compatible with living things. So when you get too much of these nitrogen molecules in your blood, amino acids are okay, but when they're in the form of this urea, it does become toxic pretty quickly in your blood, so it has to constantly be filtered out by the urea. Okay, I'm sorry, by the kidneys. But otherwise, your liver, I believe, makes most of the urea. Maybe your kidneys can as well, and it's made just by breaking down the excess amino acids. Victor has a follow-up question. Nitrogen waste in blood is in the form of urea rather than just molecules of it. Yes, yes. Because, nitrogen, pure nitrogen, is in the form of N2, which is like a gas. I think you might have a tiny amount of nitrogen gas in your blood, but mostly not, unless you're like scuba diving or something. Generally, nitrogen flows into our lungs and flows right back out for the most part. So it's what we would call inert. It's not particularly active in us. The nitrogen is coming from the proteins that we ate. Does smoking have the same negative effects of does smoking marijuana have the same negative effects as smoking cigarettes? What about cigars? So there's a lot of people try to figure this out. We'll talk about marijuana pretty soon in class, but one of the problems with trying to study about marijuana is it's hard to study because it's illegal to be used in a lot of research. So we do not have as extensive information about marijuana as we do about cigarettes. Marijuana smoke does have some carcinogens, and it certainly has the particulates that would be irritating to your lungs. Given that, though, it's not as strongly associated with cancer, and people are still trying to understand this a bit better because marijuana smoke is still going to go deep in your lungs. People tend to hold it in their lungs for longer, and so it's not that it's not going into your lungs. And in fact, a lot of people who smoke marijuana regularly do have some issues that are similar to bronchitis, right? Because they're getting all these particulates in their lungs. But there isn't the same association with cancer. And it's not entirely clear why. Marijuana does have some other compounds that might be protective in other ways, that might actually counteract some of these negative effects and actually protect from them, because there's potentially, I've seen some studies that say there's a slightly higher risk of cancer for marijuana smokers, and other studies say not. So it's a little unclear. But again, we don't have a ton of studies to go from. So we'll talk more about the effects of marijuana later. But as far as, as we seem to be able to tell related to cancer, lots of people have been smoking lots of marijuana for lots of years, and they don't seem to be dropping dead of cancer in close to the same numbers as they do from cigarette smoke. So, given that, I don't think it's a significant risk for cancer. It has other risks, but for whatever reason, not so much of a risk of cancer. Maybe none at all, but certainly nothing compared to the level that cigarette smoke has. Victor's again asking about the written portion. There is no written portion. It's all just fill-in-the-blank completion. There might be some matching. There's some pathway stuff, like pathways of air and blood. Thank you, Ritvik. I didn't have to answer that. You answered it for me. And I know I'm probably falling behind you guys, but that's okay. I'll catch up the best I can. Sophia, welcome, Sophia. I haven't seen you yet on here. Why are red blood cells considered cells, but platelets not? My understanding is that the platelets literally are not physically cells. I mentioned before they're called cell fragments. So I don't believe they're like cytoplasm with a cell membrane. They're not structurally a cell, but they are biological material. Again, I'm going to look that up because now it's kind of bugging me that I don't know why. But I know that they're not cells. Like, they're not a cell membrane with cytoplasm like a complete cell. Jerry asks, is it possible to have plaques in veins? I don't think it's a problem. I've never heard of it being a problem. You don't have the same linings in veins as you do in arteries. You don't have the same blood pressure for those linings get damaged. So I haven't heard about it ever being a problem. I guess, which is good, right? Sophia says, when you hear your heartbeat, what are you hearing? Yeah, that's kind of one of those fun ones. It is on your circulation sheet, but to sort of briefly, and I can see that Neil has this a couple of comments later. Thank you guys for helping each other out. Yeah, the opening and closing of the valves. So I know that sounds odd, right? But they literally do. And it's the closing of what we call the atrioventricular, which are the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, is one of them. And then the other is the closing of the semilunar valves, the ones at the entrance to the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Okay, thanks, Neil, for chiming in. Oofmaster, if she wants a more specific explanation and that wasn't enough, let me know, but that's all you need. Ritvik, what does it mean for our hearts to skip a beat? Yeah, that's kind of cool too. So, I think we have this impression that our hearts are sort of like perfect, right? Like, like forever and ever is part of our life. But actually, if you measured them, they're not that perfect. They do skip they do get faster and slower. The electrical signals are not perfect, so they might, quote, skip a beat. I'm not sure they actually skipped it, but it can slow down briefly and speed back up again. Sometimes that might be caused by something physiologically, maybe just the pacemaker cells aren't perfect. I'm not really sure, but I do know that it's actually quite common for people's heart rates to change a fair amount. And you don't have to be exercising or something. There's a lot of things that can affect your heart rate. Get some water here. Whew, talking for a long time. How can high fevers be deadly? The main way I know that they're deadly is that your brain cells don't like to get too hot. So my understanding is if you have a fever over about 105, 106, that the brain cells will start to be damaged. We don't like that, right? So that's why we worry when people have really high fevers, is the damage to the brain cells. And remember, that's going to be more permanent, right? Because your brain cells aren't able to replace themselves. Hi, Arshia. Nice smiley face. You guys have all the cool emojis. Anshul, it is when you feel like your heart is beating too fast or too hard. Yeah, and there's terms for all this stuff, again, a little beyond the scope of this class, but like your heart beating too fast is called tachycardia, and sometimes when it beats really fast, you can actually feel it beating in your chest. Again, we don't always know why, right? Not necessarily a problem. Sometimes it is. Okay, Victor, the lymph doesn't absorb proteins, right? You told me that, but your PowerPoint has a diagram that says it does. So when you say absorb proteins, I don't know if you mean like from the tissue. Not quite sure where you mean it's absorbing them from. Lymphatic vessels are more leaky, have bigger openings than the blood capillaries do. Entire white blood cells can get out of capillaries, and particularly lymphatic vessels. So yeah, I would say proteins could go in and out. When we say they don't, you might be thinking back to when I talked about this idea that things like the placenta or your intestinal lining can't absorb proteins. Yes, because then they're having to diffuse, through cell membranes, not between cells. So now we're talking at a smaller level. And things like your intestinal lining are going to protect against large things going through for the most part, right? It's not perfect, but they sort of try, because you don't want, for example, bacteria coming through your intestinal lining, right? So you have some protection against that. So it depends what you're talking about absorbing. If you're talking about like things like the placenta or the intestinal lining, they're specifically protecting against a lot of things going through, then proteins aren't going to go through, but amino acids could. If you're talking about capillaries and lymphatic vessels, lymphatic capillaries, there's actually openings between the cells between the cells that line those vessels that could be larger openings. So yes, proteins could potentially go in and out of there. Fluids move from places of high concentration to places of low concentration. Why is it that nitrogen from the air doesn't move into our blood vessels? The movement of molecules like that is related to pressure, partial pressure. I've known the answer to that in the past, and I can't remember it right now. So I don't know. I know that I don't think we have zero nitrogen, but we don't have very much. I know that this is a problem when people are scuba diving, they're under pressure in the ocean, that more nitrogen is forced into your blood, and then when it comes out of solution in your blood, you get the bends, and that can be a problem. It can actually kill you when you're scuba diving. So I think there are conditions of high pressure. I don't know if it has to do with nitrogen being at a sort of pressure in the air where it doesn't diffuse into your blood. I think it's something having to do with that, but I don't know that in enough detail right now to give you a very specific answer, but I think it has to do with pressure somehow. Is thyroxine given to people who are dangerously obese? I mean, that's an interesting, you guys make great connections. That's an interesting connection, this idea that, I know you're connecting it to this idea that thyroxine can make you lose weight because it increases cellular respiration. The problem is it would have a whole bunch of other effects, right? You can't just give people a whole bunch of thyroxine. It would change a bunch of things. It would influence their heart rate and a whole bunch of other things. So it's not something we could give you on an ongoing basis. It would cause too many other side effects. That's the problem with hormones. There's a lot of other things we can do for people who are dangerously obese that would be less complicated than that, right? So, we do other things that are complicated, like gastric bypass surgery, things like that. But there's other things we could do that would be probably less problematic than giving them thyroxine. How do the alveoli fill up with fluid in certain diseases like pneumonia? And what is the fluid? Yeah, there's fluid in the tissues of your lungs that can get pushed in there. Sometimes it's from what's called pulmonary edema, if you remember the term edema. When your heart doesn't work well and you have a problem called congestive heart failure, sometimes the blood sort of backs up in the pulmonary artery and it causes all this pressure on the lungs. This is my understanding of it without doing a bunch of research. And then the fluid that's already in your lung tissues can kind of get pushed into your alveoli, and that can fill them up. Also, your cells produce a lot of fluid as a result of infection, right? Just like you get sort of, pus and fluid that causes swelling and inflammation and all that. So you could get fluid that your lungs are producing in response to infection. And the idea is if you get enough fluid in those alveoli, the air can't get in there, and then you're just not going to get enough oxygen, and you'll essentially sort of suffocate. And the fluid, I believe, is probably just your own body fluid, water and electrolytes and things like that. Do we have to be able to identify all the valves on the heart? Generally not. I haven't been doing that for a few years in the class. There's probably some references to what the valves do, but I'm not going to have you identify them, I don't think. I think there's a pathway question, but it's just chambers and vessels. I don't know why I say I think. I know there's a pathway question. Be able to identify the chambers and vessels. When is CPR and AED used? For heart attacks, cardiac arrest, or both? Good question. CPR can be for either. CPR is cardiopulmonary resuscitation. That's when you compress their chest, right? And the purpose of that is literally to squeeze their heart and pump the blood, okay, when the heart's not effectively doing that. The idea of that is to keep the blood circulating to the organs. Okay, and then the pulmonary part is you breathe into their mouth so that you keep some oxygen going so that the blood continues to get oxygenated and you're circulating it. What that's doing is keeping the cells and tissues alive, right? Giving them a source of oxygen. You're not doing anything to help their heart, right? CPR does not fix anybody's heart ever, right? It's a stopgap. It's a measure to keep oxygenated blood flowing. Getting tired. Oxygenated blood flowing to their cells while you're waiting for something that can fix their heart, which is usually emergency people, right? In the last number of years, we've had AED, which is awesome. AEDs are automatic external defibrillators, so those are able to measure the electrical rhythm of the heart and determine if it's in fibrillation or if it's stopped. And particularly if it's in fibrillation, you can deliver a shock to the heart, which will hopefully allow the pacemaker to restart the heart. So that is intended to address fibrillation and the resulting cardiac arrest, meaning that the heart is not pumping. So you could do CPR and use an AED on a person while you're waiting for emergency people to get there and be able to do something else. And the main reason that's important is because that sudden cardiac death would really occur within minutes, right? So if you can do the AED and get their heart going before the emergency personnel get there, that's great. That actually does something to their heart. CPR, again, is just, in the meantime, can you get some oxygenated blood going to the tissues? Mira, is it possible to identify and remove a B cell that produces antibodies to a specific... Yeah, okay. So this was in your... it's in the immune PowerPoint a little bit, this idea of passive immunity, right? So we've tried a bunch of things. The problem with taking a B cell and transplanting it is that that's going to trigger an immune response because your B cell has different antigens than another person, right? So you have that problem. You could potentially put in antibodies because they're just proteins. But what we find is that one person's antibodies do not work very well in another person's antibodies, in another person's body, okay? So what happens is they're not very effective. They're removed by that person's body in a fairly short period of time. So there's a few very specific situations where we do transplant antibodies from one person to another, but it's not that effective, so most of the time we don't do that. It's much more effective to get the person to have their own immune response if that's possible. The main example of antibodies going from one person to another is really from a mother to a baby, okay? So we're getting maternal immunity. There's another word for that I can't think of at the moment. Let's see. What are the differences between the lymphatic vessels and blood vessels? I don't know. The lymphatic vessels, the structure is a little different. As I mentioned, the openings are a little bit bigger. The cells are probably different as well, but I'm not sure exactly how, right? But they're constructed in such a way that they're more permeable. Lymphatic vessels are more permeable than blood vessels, so that different kinds of things can get in and out. Gian, why are pathogens so difficult for us to fight off? Because they've been evolving for a long time, right, to be a pain to us. So they have been evolving. It's coevolution, right? They've been evolving defenses to our immune system for a long time. So sometimes we have ways to fight them, and they've evolved ways to fight our defenses, right? I know, it's a bummer. Hate viruses, evil. Okay, so that's kind of the short answer to that, right, is they've evolved defenses to our own immune system. Oh, Siri's helping out with the AED question. Thanks. And you are right. Nice job, Siri. See, I'm behind. Tanisha's asking about hearing a heartbeat. So go back and we did an explanation of the valves closing. And that's essentially your two sets of valves closing. Okay, Siri is also responding in real life. Thanks that you would want to use an AED and perform CPR for yes. And if you guys want to have training in that, you should get some first aid training. We do that in physiology, and you can learn how you can actually do CPR and AED sort of at the same time. Thanks, Sophia. What is pus made of? Thanks, Annie. Pus is kind of like your own white blood cells, a bunch of fluid, dead bacteria, dead pathogens, all that kind of stuff that just sort of piles up. People talk about it in terms of like a war. It's like the battleground, right? This is all like the dead soldiers and everything lying on the battlefield after it's over, and somebody's got to come and clean it up. So the pus sort of builds up, and typically you have cells in your own body that would come and eat up kind of all this stuff, but sometimes it sort of gets stuck. You know how you get like a little bubble of pus sometimes? It just sort of gets stuck somewhere. Sometimes your own body can eat that up, and sometimes it has a little trouble, and we'll actually kind of remove it ourselves. How do muscles contract? So we didn't go into that a lot of detail in our class, but if I want to give you sort of the 10-second answer, a nerve signal goes to the muscle fibers, and the muscle fibers are made up of, get my arms in the picture here, the muscle fibers are made up of actin and myosin filaments. Remember those proteins that you learned about? And the actin and myosin filaments can slide along each other like this, right? And they actually have these little, pretend there's two of these here, they actually have these little legs that go like this, and they literally move the filaments back and forth, and they get the energy for doing that from ATP, so that the nerve signal comes and it says, okay, contract, and these filaments start doing this, and the muscle gets shorter, and we say that it contracts. Okay, that's a brief explanation. How is CPR effective if you aren't pushing on the heart directly? Okay, you're pushing on with CPR, you're pushing on the sternum, hopefully not the ribs. If you get the ribs, you're going to break a bunch of ribs. Okay, so you're pushing on the sternum here, and the sternum is right over your heart, and it's this big flat bone. So as you push really hard on the sternum, and you have to push hard, okay, you're literally squishing the heart between the sternum and the back wall of your chest, probably your spine or whatever's back there, right? And you literally are pumping it. You're squishing it down and squishing those chambers and pumping the blood out, right? So you're squishing the heart by pushing down on the sternum. Are vaccines only made of small samples of viruses? Well, it's a little more complex than that, because first of all, you can make vaccines for bacteria as well, right? Again, there's a number of ways that you can make vaccines. I think sometimes they're heat damaged. I think sometimes they're physically broken up. And I think there's some other ways that you can make them that involve other organisms doing things for us. I'm not an expert on that. I think some of the ways they make vaccines are kind of complex. But sort of the level of understanding that I have and that I would expect you to have would be that really all you need is enough of the antigen to stimulate the person's immune response, a primary immune response, right? Because the body recognizes that foreign antigen. And it just needs to be in a form that's not going to infect you with the pathogen, right? And that's really the key things that you need to know about a vaccine. Why is the aortic valve not called an aortic sphincter? Okay, good question, Victor. So sphincters and valves are two different things. And the book, your textbook is older and it uses the terms incorrectly. So the difference is shape. Valves are typically like trap doors, right? Some of them have multiple things, like I'm showing with my hands here, like the bicuspid valve has two cusps, and it sort of goes like this, right? So some valves sort of do this movement and let the fluid through one way but not the other, right? They could be like a little one-way valve like this, okay? A sphincter, and so the valves in your veins and in your heart are these type, they're actual valves. Sphincters are circular muscles. So you want a circular muscle where you want to be able to sort of completely close off something that is round, like a tube, right? So you have a sphincter at the top and bottom of your stomach that closes with a muscle like this and makes the diameter smaller, right? You have sphincters, you know about these. You have a sphincter on your urethra to stop the urine flow. You have an anal sphincter, right? And we can control those to make those muscles close completely. You kind of wouldn't want it to be like this, right? So a valve is more like a flap that can open and close, or cusps or something. A sphincter is a circular muscle that can close off a tube. okay, whereas a valve is typically in the middle of some kind of a tube. Ritvik's asking about maternal immunity. So it's the ability of the mother's antibodies to pass through the placenta, which some of them can if they're small enough. Not all antibodies can. But some of the mother's antibodies can diffuse across the placenta into the fetus's blood and temporarily fight pathogens that could get into the fetus. And again, some pathogens can get into the fetus, but not all of them. Okay, so, but that gives the fetus some protection because its own immune system is still forming and it's not very strong. It's not that great at having its own immune response. So it's pretty vulnerable. Let's see, Akash is helping out with the vaccine question, a weak dose. Yeah, I'd be careful of the weak dose thing though, because, you know, if you only had a few virus particles, they're still viruses. I wouldn't give anybody a weak dose of a polio virus, right? So that word weak is difficult. You see the word weak or attenuated, to me that means weak in function, right? Not weak in dose. Dose implies the amount. So it's not that you would want to give somebody fewer good viruses, they're just going to multiply, right? You could give them weak viruses or bacteria in the sense that they are not functional, like they're functionally weak. Dosage means amount. Diksha asks, what is hypertension? It's simply the medical term for high blood pressure. Oops. Jerry, why are there different vaccine requirements between different countries? Really simply because there are different infectious diseases that are prevalent in those countries, right? There's countries, for example, where tuberculosis is common, but it's not so common here. But if you came here from a country where tuberculosis is more common, that's actually a terrible example because we don't really have a vaccine for that. But the idea would be that we would want to protect against that, right? If I go to a country where yellow fever is more common, I'm going to get a yellow fever vaccine before I go there. Otherwise, I won't get one because it's not common here, right? So it really just depends on what pathogens are common in those locations, right? So if somebody is coming to a place or going to a place, they might want to get a vaccine to protect them. Thanks, Jerry, for answering the question about high blood pressure. Okay, Dee Dee's asking, does angioplasty and stent insertion prevent or reduce risks of heart attack? It can potentially, yes. So the idea would be that even while a person is having a heart attack, you could put a stent in the very vessel that is clogged up with the blood clot, okay? And you could push the clot aside, push the plaque aside, and get the blood flowing, and essentially sort of stop that heart attack in motion, okay? Potentially, you're going to stop there from being a heart attack in that vessel in the future, but not always, because these stents do get their own plaques, and plaque can stick to them, and they do, I shouldn't say get their own plaques. Blood clots sometimes form on the stents, right? So they can get their own problems. Always remember, of course, that you can get a heart attack in a different blood vessel. But sometimes we do stents preventatively. If a person, for example, has chest pain, and we do an imaging, and we see, my cat's running around crazy, and we see that a certain coronary artery is looking dangerous, like it's got a lot of plaque, or we think for some reason they might have a heart attack in that coronary artery, we could put a stent in preventatively, and we do that sometimes. And hopefully that would prevent a heart attack in that particular coronary artery in the future. I'm sure it does sometimes, and that's great. Stents have really reduced the rate of death from heart attacks over the last number of years. Again, they just don't solve the original problem of the atherosclerosis, right? Kanishka Kumar. Hi, I don't think I know you, but that's a cool name. What is the system function of the apex? You know, apex is really just a description of that shape. Apex, it's funny because actually the funny part to me, apex describes like, we call it like a mountain, or the apex is the top part that you have to get over, like the apex of something, right? Oddly enough, though, it's the bottom of the heart, right? But it has that same shape, so we use that word apex, okay, which always seems odd to me. But it really is just a location. It's like saying the bottom of the heart. It doesn't really have a function. The apex is the two ventricles together, so they have the function of the ventricles, right? But it's not really, it's just a location on the heart. Ashwin, hi. Do white blood cells and platelets have nuclei? White blood cells do. They are regular cells. Platelets, probably not, because they're these cell fragments. So I don't think they do because they're cell fragments. They're not real cells. Red blood cells don't because they push them out so they can fill up with hemoglobin. But white blood cells are regular cells, and they do have nuclei. Would you say that the epiglottis is a valve? Yes, Aditi, the epiglottis is more of a valve because it's more like this. It is a flap of tissue that can cover, that can move like this within a tube, right, covering up your trachea when you swallow. So it is not a sphincter. Your trachea does not do this. That wouldn't work because your trachea is really hard, right? It's got that cartilage. So yes, the epiglottis is a valve. What is immune tolerance? Just to check if I have the right definition. Good question, Yash. So, keep in mind the word tolerance. It means we tolerate, right? So in this idea is that your immune system will tolerate certain things. We want to. We want to be able to tolerate pollen, right? I don't want to have an immune response every time I breathe in some pollen. I certainly don't want to have an immune response to my cat skin, right? So we want to have, and I certainly want to have immune tolerance to my own cells. I don't want to attack my own cells. Okay, so we want to have immune tolerance to antigens that are common in our environment, that are non-threatening, that are part of our own body. So that is the part of our immune system that's like, okay, that's okay, we're not going to attack it, as opposed to immune response. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. Thanks, Sophia, for helping out with the nucleus question. Is edema specific to problems with lymph, or does it include swelling of tissues of any fluid? I think it's more general because, as I mentioned in an earlier question, pulmonary edema is used when the lungs fill with fluid, and that's not necessarily from lymph. So I think I think you're right, can be used more generally to mean fluid. But there's actually another, probably more specific term called lymphedema, but I think people often just say edema because, it's a shorter word, right? But it's probably more technically the kind of swelling that you get in your limbs is lymphedema. Lillian is asking about diseases in the lymphatic system. So, that's tricky because the lymphatic system does a lot of stuff. You could have lymphatic disorders in terms of things impacting your immunity, in terms of swelling, maybe in terms of things that happen to the lymphoid organs, like problems with your spleen, problems with your appendix. People get appendicitis, right? I don't know if that's really considered a disease of the lymphatic system, but it kind of is. Their appendix is a lymphoid organ, right? So, I would say any of the function can be, and the structures can be potentially have disorders. Are there specific functions that tonsils have that are not shared by the other lymphoid organs? I would say only in terms of their location. Because they're in your throat, they're particularly vulnerable. I think you guys all know from personal experience, we get a lot of viruses in our throat, right? We get sore throats a lot. The viruses tend to lodge in our throat simply because they're coming in our respiratory system, right? A lot of viruses are airborne, so that as we breathe them in, they tend to infect the cells of our throat, and that's one of the reasons why it's good that we have a lot of lymph nodes and tonsils in our throat. Your tonsils you can actually see them in the back of your mouth if you still have them. I don't. But, I think that's providing some of that immediate immune function right there in your throat where the viruses are coming in. So you might have a little bit less of that function if you don't have tonsils. I don't have tonsils, but I still have lymph nodes in my throat. Does it maybe reduce my ability a little bit in my throat? Sure, it might. Too late for me, right? That's why we try not to take them out anymore. Ritvik's asking about the ETC of mitochondria. Okay, so that's something that used to be in our biology curriculum. I haven't taught it for a few years now because, believe it or not, we're really trying to cut down on the content in biology. If you take AP Bio, you will definitely learn a lot about the ETC. It stands for electron transport chain. And it's basically the process that in your mitochondria actually creates the ATP. It actually is what sort of generates the energy that allows the ATP synthase enzyme to attach that third phosphate and make the ATP. Okay, so it's also what's disabled. Just lost my train of thought. There's something that works because it disables the ETC in the mitochondria. Can't remember what it is right now. But anyway, it is a critical part of forming ATP in your mitochondria. What's the difference between a lymphocyte and an antibody? Lymphocyte is an actual cell. You can tell by the word root, CYTE. Use those word roots, right? Lympho means like white blood cell. Antibodies are simply proteins. So lymphocyte is a whole cell, right, formed from your hematopoietic stem cells. The antibodies are proteins that are produced by some of your immune cells called plasma cells, okay, that come from your B cells. And thank you, Gian. I need to just look ahead. You guys are answering each other's questions, doing a great job. Thank you so much. You're ahead of me. Tanisha, when someone gets an appendicitis, what happens to their appendix? I think it can get infected or inflamed. So it starts to swell up, and it starts to it potentially could rupture. That's kind of the worst thing that can happen. It doesn't always, but sometimes it ruptures, and then you'd get a bunch of internal infection that could be quite dangerous. So, but we often don't know about it until it ruptures, and then we have to go in and take it out. Sometimes it heals on its own, but that's kind of the main danger, is it gets infected and inflamed and it can rupture. Yes, Diksha, that's the reason we can survive, because we have a lot of lymphoid organs. Ellie, you're welcome. I'm really glad this is helpful. I'm excited about doing this, so thank you guys all for coming. That's really awesome. Hey, do those little carrots mean me too? That's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Learn something new every day. I hope that's what it means. Tell me if not. I don't want to be stupid. Tina's asking. Oh, wait. No, that's not Tina. Ting Zhao. I don't know who that is, so thank you. It sounds like you're a visitor. What is the difference between thymus glands and tissue? You know, I'll be honest. I use those terms interchangeably. There might be a technical difference. I'm not sure I care that much. Tissue is such a general word in biology. It just means a group of cells. Gland is a word that we use for something that's secreting a hormone. So I don't know if the thymus tissue over the heart doesn't secrete the hormone. I have no idea. So I just call it all the same thing. In fact, usually I just say thymus, so I don't have to worry about it. But I think people tend to refer, on the pig at least, to the ones in the throat as being glands and the part over the heart as being tissue. I don't get all hung up over that. I'm not sure which part does what, so personally I'm not worried about it. There might be a technical difference, but don't stress. Diksha, keep doing these videos. Oh, I'm really glad. Yeah, I'm super excited about this. If this works out well, I might even do, I thought about maybe doing some homework hours if there's a hard homework to help out, or maybe doing, maybe doing these once a week as some of the other teachers do. So yeah, we'll keep it up if it's helpful. And just as a side note, I think you guys know some of the other teachers are doing, and Mr. Jones has got quite a following now. I can't claim to play these fancy video games that he plays, but I'll come up with something. Maybe my cats can entertain you. But at any rate, you guys are all invited to each other's. You know that. We work as a team. So you're welcome to go to his. If you're my students, other students are welcome to come to mine. We have students that aren't even at Monte Vista that are listening in on our chats. So that's really awesome. We really... we love it. It's such a great way to communicate with you guys and to provide a forum that works for us when we're all at home. Yeah, thanks, Telmetrics. Yes, some people do eat the thymus. I know, weird. People eat all kinds of things. Some people eat brains and hearts and placentas. Probably want to stay away from those brains, mad cow disease and all. Do we have to know the bicarbonate buffering system? Again, you could get all technical. You guys haven't taken chemistry, so I'm not going to get all hung up on that. If you know enough to understand that the carbon dioxide dissolves in the blood, forms these molecules that eventually make an acid, honestly, that's fine. The reason that system is helpful to know about is to understand sort of like the quantity that's necessary to change the pH significantly. Not for us. We don't need to worry about it. If you know the general direction that things are moving, I'm pretty happy. I mean, hey, this is freshman biology, right? You guys are doing pretty amazing already. How can cancer occur in lymphoid organs if white blood cells move around all the time? In terms of, well, that actually makes the problem worse. So I actually think, and I'm pretty sure of this, I won't, not 100%, but I'm pretty sure that the cancer that is in your white blood cells, which is lymphoma and leukemia, depending on what type of white blood cell, actually originates like in your stem cells in your bone marrow. And then those cells are sort of going around. I suppose it could happen in white blood cells that are in your lymphoid organs, like your spleen. I'm not sure. I think most of it originates in the stem cells because they're dividing a lot, right? The problem, of course, is then it's transporting these cancerous cells all over your body instead of being in one place. So it's like it's pretty bad, right? And that's why people can die more quickly from cancers of the blood, meaning leukemia and lymphoma. You're welcome, Tanisha. Does blood volume refer to the amount of water? Okay, so blood volume is literally the volume of blood. If I took the blood out of your body and put it in a container and measured it, that would be your blood volume. We don't worry about how much of that is water. So blood volume refers to whole blood, which is everything. It would be your red blood cells, your platelets, but most of your blood, remember, is water and red blood cells. Those are the two main things in your blood. Okay. And that the blood volume is important because it's one of the main things that maintains your blood pressure, right? So if you lose blood, you're losing both water and red blood cells. So you're losing blood volume, and that's going to decrease your blood pressure. Okay? Yep, certainly you got it, Neil. Play video games with Mr. Jones. I would lose horrendously and not even know what to do. Ting, why are chest wounds so serious, like the air pressure or blood loss? Yeah, so, to understand that, you do have to understand how breathing works, okay? So breathing works because there's a difference in pressure between your chest cavity, not really the lungs themselves, although I guess they're kind of in the same pressure as the chest cavity. So, but between your chest cavity and the air outside in the atmosphere, atmospheric air pressure, right? It's that pressure differential that makes the air move in and out. So if I poke a hole through your ribs and into the chest cavity, and I pull that knife out, now there's a big hole, right? Air is flowing in and out between the atmosphere and the inside of your chest cavity. Maybe I didn't even poke your lungs, but the chest cavity is now continuously at the same pressure as the air outside. And once that occurs, there is no difference in air pressure between your lungs and the outside air. No air is going to move in or out, no matter what your diaphragm does. Okay? So what's going to happen is you're going to hear air sort of rushing in and out of that hole. The lungs will either do nothing or collapse. Air will not effectively go in and out, and you're going to suffocate pretty quickly, right? So the first aid for that is if there's a knife in somebody's chest cavity, leave it in there. If there's a hole, plug it up, right? So that you can try to help maintain this pressure differential, okay? Hopefully you'll never have to do that. Do we need to know about the villi and diffusion that occurs in the placenta? Akash, only in general terms. You do need to understand the concept of certain things being able to diffuse across the placenta and certain things not, right? I thought it was just an interesting connection that it looks a whole lot like the villi in your intestines. And, really it's so helpful if you can just see that your body kind of uses these same strategies in different ways. The whole concept of villi is just to increase surface area, right? So it's the same thing in your placenta, right? You want molecules to diffuse. Diffusion takes time. By providing more surface area, I can maximize the molecules that can diffuse in the same amount of time. I can maximize the rate of diffusion. So if I've got that, blood from the fetus and blood from the mother, molecules able to diffuse across the placenta, I want to maximize the rate of that diffusion as well, right? Because the blood's flowing all the time. So you need to keep those molecules diffusing as fast as you can. So having a villi is just a way of increasing surface area in the placenta this time so that more molecules can diffuse. Yeah, Sophia has it right, more or less. I don't know if we would use the term equilibrium, but she's got the right idea. Gianna's offering about the opening the cavity. The diaphragm's not able to make a pressure. Yeah, great, you guys got it. Nice work. Okay. So you got your own little chat session, right? I'm assuming that's kind of similar to the small intestine villi absorption. Yes. Thank you, Siri. I agree. TQ, don't lymph nodes destroy cancer cells in the lymph, or is it a problem with concentration gain? Yeah, there's a bunch of issues. I would say by the time those cancer cells are getting to the lymph, you probably have a whole lot of them. I would say that's problem number one. The other problem is that cancer cells are also very good at messing up. Messing up is not a great scientific word, but like the way that I said that viruses and other pathogens are good at evading the defenses of our immune system, so are cancer cells, which is weird because they're part of us, right? But it kind of works the same way. The cancers that are better at evading our immune system are more successful, and there are these more aggressive cancers. So even if the cancer cells are in contact with our lymph nodes, I don't think there's any guarantee the lymph nodes can do anything about them. They do tend to accumulate in the lymph nodes, which is why the lymph nodes are often removed when somebody has cancer, but I don't think the lymph nodes are able to fight it necessarily. Unfortunately, that's the problem, is we aren't very good at fighting the cancer cells. And yes, concentration does matter. Your body just starts to get overwhelmed from having lots of cancer cells. Phagocytes are not lymphocytes, right? Even though they are both white blood cells. Phagocytes is more of a functional term. It means that they do phagocytosis, which is a way of saying they can eat up other cells. Okay? So I would say phagocytes are lymphocytes, but I think it's more like some lymphocytes are phagocytic cells. They can do phagocytosis. They might have other names for the type of cells that they are, but I believe that they are white blood cells. I'm not sure if you have other cells that can do phagocytosis that are not white blood cells. You might. Can't think of that right now. Whew. How many lymphatic organs do we need to know? Need to know. I mean, I'm not going to have you list them or anything, but you should be familiar with them, right? And I mean, there's ones we've talked about over and over. spleen, tonsils, appendix, right? Thymus. There's a few other sort of ones that aren't very common. Don't worry about it, right? But if they were in context, you should be able to say, hey, I know that's a lymphoid organ. Let's see, even though they're both white blood cells. Da, 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 da. Lungs at outside pressure. Lungs. Oh, okay, thank you. Comment from Telemetrics clarifying. So the lungs are at the outside pressure. I have to think about that. There has to be a pressure differential because the alveoli, I feel like the pressure differential has to be between the alveoli ultimately and your airway passages. But the pressure thing in the lungs is a little complex. I'd have to look that up. So I will decline to comment on that one. Yes, the carrots mean me too. Thank you, Victor. Sometimes I'm out of touch. Appreciate that. I like it. It was like, but it was, you know, it was interesting though. It was very intuitive. Like I knew immediately what people meant. But it's interesting to me. Okay, I'm just going to go off task for a moment here. I wonder why people didn't use quote signs for that. Like why that didn't become a thing online, because quote signs mean ditto, the same. Anyway, that's just a random thought. Raghu, how does blood volume relate to blood pressure? Blood volume is one of the things that contributes to blood pressure. I remember that heart, blood, and blood vessels are the three things that contribute to blood pressure. That's the way I remember it. So your heart contributes to blood pressure by how much your heart is beating, right? And you can imagine that. The more your heart is beating, the faster your heart is beating, the stronger it's beating, the higher your blood pressure is going to be, right? How does your blood contribute? Because of the actual blood volume. Just like if I turn the water on higher, having more volume of blood increases your blood pressure. And then the blood vessels increase it because if they constrict or if they are stiffer, that's going to be sort of, you know, tighter, right? Pushing on the blood. So that will also increase your blood pressure. So your blood pressure is sort of a combination of all those factors. Okay, so blood volume is one factor that relates to blood pressure. For your purposes, know intuitively that if you have more blood, that's going to increase your blood pressure. If you have less blood, that's going to decrease your blood pressure. We're actually going to talk about that a bunch more when we get to the kidney, starting on Friday and then the week after break. What is immunological homeostasis? So that's a way of referring to this balance that I talked about earlier between immune tolerance and immune response. Right? There's a nice graphic of this on my blood lymphatic immunity guide. If I don't think this is one of my students, but if you can get access to that, there's a nice graphic that sort of shows a little seesaw. And it's this idea that we constantly balance our immune response against our immune tolerance. And it's a lot like homeostasis because it might go in one direction for a while. Maybe we're fighting an infection and we have to have an immune response. But then you need that to come back. You don't want to have a constant immune response. That's stressful for our bodies, like having inflammation all the time. Right? So we need to sort of maintain that homeostasis. Why is there a trope of eating ice cream after you're getting your tonsils removed? Because, damn it, I had to go to the hospital and get my tonsils removed, and I want some ice cream. That's why. And your throat hurts. And ice cream feels really good, and it makes everything better. That's all. Will we be tested on the umbilical arteries and veins, also the placenta? A little bit. I mean, you know, there's like 30 questions on the test and lots of things. But, yeah, there's going to definitely be a little bit of placenta and umbilical arteries and veins. The umbilical arteries and veins, though, I will tell you, is more of an issue for the pig, frankly, than for the written test. It might be a little bit, but it's more for the pig and the pig practical, just because we can see them on the pig, right? Because it's still a fetus. In you guys, those vessels have all sort of shrunk down into nothingness, and it's not really an issue for us anymore. Can the blood loss from the fetus separating from the placenta be harmful or life-threatening? Yes, I think I mentioned briefly in class that when a woman gives birth and gives birth to the placenta has to detach from the uterine wall, from the side of the woman's uterus, and there's a bunch of tiny little capillaries that, you know, get broken, right? And just like when any other capillaries get broken, the body, the woman's body is going to repair that, right? The platelets will form and it'll repair that. But if for some reason that doesn't happen fast enough, or I don't know exactly what goes wrong, but sometimes the woman bleeds too much, and sometimes they'll actually have to give her blood or something, and if you didn't have that kind of medical care, you could potentially die in childbirth. I don't know the statistics. I think it's my impression off the top of my head that it's more common for women without medical care to die of infection after childbirth, but that's probably related to having all these open capillaries, I would imagine, or having weird things stuck in there during the process of childbirth, right? So that's kind of getting beyond what I know off the top of my head, but yes, it can if the woman loses enough blood. Nice description, Raghu. Yes, the balance between a person being hypersensitive and being immunocompromised. Yes, nice use of terminology. And we don't always use the word hypersensitive, but you've got the right idea. Hypersensitive, I think we do use in reference to sort of allergies. Let's see. Siri is asking, memory cells that have foreign antigens stay in immune organs. Sorry. So the body wouldn't want to send white blood cells or antibodies to those organs. When pathogens enter those organs, what does the body do? I'm not sure I understand that question. If you have pathogens entering your organs, you'd have to fight that. Oh, look, you can see my kitty in the background climbing around. Hi, Pinky. I'm not quite sure I understand your question, so I'm going to punt that one for now. Ting Zhao, do you think this test is going to be difficult for us from previous years? Okay, so that makes it sound like you're one of my students, but I don't recognize your name, so I don't know if you're using a pseudonym or what. But anyway, whoever you are, Ting Zhao, I do track from year to year. I will tell you that people did a little worse on this test in previous years than they did on the digestive quiz, if that helps you at all. I think it's kind of it's a fair amount of information, right? We went through 3 or 4 systems and a number of things that are easy to mix up, and it kind of came at you pretty fast, which I appreciate. One thing, though, I'm actually thinking is that this year might be better because last year it was the week after break, and I think that was pretty hard for people, right? So right now it's all kind of fresh in your mind. So hopefully it'll be a good year. I'm optimistic, okay? So I'd say it's medium, right? If you know your terms and you know your concepts, it should be okay, as always. Oh, John, you're clarifying you meant is it damaging to the fetus? Oh, no, because the fetus is already out and done by the time the placenta comes out. When the fetus comes out and is now, the baby, they cut the umbilical cord very soon. Not always, but it's sort of traditional to do it very soon. You could actually wait, but we often cut the umbilical cord fairly soon. So whether the placenta has already, usually by the time the placenta detaches, I think, when I've seen childbirth, the umbilical cord was already cut. Even if you had left it on, remember that literally in the moments of childbirth, the baby's body starts to change. It starts to breathe its own air. Its kidneys are going to start producing urine. So it's going to start to do its own function very quickly. So even if there's blood coming out of the placenta, like the umbilical arteries have already started to shrink down, so it's not losing blood to the placenta anymore. All of that shuts down, starts to shut down within minutes after birth. It's really a pretty incredible process. So I don't know if they're being damaged to the placenta. I think it's more a risk to the mom. Do blood vessels constrict and dilate depending on how much work organs need to do? Yes, excellent question. Yes, so that's exactly what happens. You use the example of blood vessels to digestive organs dilating after a meal and to muscles after exercise. Yes, I would say during exercise, right? And it goes the other way. You only have so much blood flow. So after a meal, the blood flow to your muscles would actually decrease a little bit. And if you started to exercise on a full stomach, you would decrease the blood flow to your intestines a little bit. Okay? So there is some compensation there. And that's good. That allows your body to sort of customize where the blood is flowing. Ashwin, how does waste travel back to the placenta? Just in the blood. You're just going to waste is going to be things like carbon dioxide and urea, right? And they're literally just floating in the blood that's going through the umbilical artery to the placenta, and then they could diffuse into the mother's blood. She would then literally exhale out the carbon dioxide that the baby's cells produced, right? And the baby's urea would go into her urine. So her body's doing double duty. Good question. Does laughing occur in the larynx? I almost want to laugh. Actually, there's a lot of diaphragm. If you kind of feel yourself, there's kind of a breathing. You're sort of like gasping quickly, but there is a sound that comes out of your larynx because air is being forced out quickly. So when you laugh, your diaphragm's kind of quickly contracting, and so that you're going to force air out kind of quickly through your larynx. So some of the sound does come through your larynx, yes. I don't know if all of it does. I'll have to think about that. Okay, Sophia asks, in hospitals, when people say there's an organ donor that's a match for you, it's more than just blood type. If it were just blood type, it would actually be a whole lot easier. There's actually hundreds of antigens on your blood cells, and to transplant a whole organ, a lot of those have to match. So it's very difficult to find a person that has a lot of these matching antigens. Sometimes relatives do. Sometimes relatives don't even match these. And it's called your MLA antigens. So it's going to be a lot fewer people. So if none of your relatives match, then it's like very low chance that you might find a stranger, right? But it's possible. So people go on big databases to volunteer that you can find if anybody's a match for you. Lillian asks, is the umbilical cord attached to the placenta? Yes. So the umbilical cord, think about what you've seen in the pig. The umbilical cord has the umbilical vein and artery inside of it. One end of it is attached to the placenta. And I think there's a nice picture of this somewhere that sort of shows it sort of expanding out into the placenta. And then the other end is, of course, attached to the fetus. And those blood vessels just continue on in the fetus's body. So the cord is really just the thing in between. What do hospitals do to prevent a patient's body from rejecting a transplant? Obviously, they try to give them the best match they can, and then afterwards, most of the time, the person's going to get immunosuppressant drugs that suppress their immune system from being quite so sensitive so that it's less likely to attack. It's a careful balance because you need them to be able to fight infections, right? But you have to suppress it a little bit so that they're able to tolerate, right? It's this homeostasis, so that they're able to tolerate having this foreign stuff in their body, foreign antigens. Did my umbilical vein and artery become another normal, or is it useless after birth? It's closer to being useless. My understanding is that it shrivels up into sort of ligaments, like tiny little strings that are no longer transporting blood. So yes, in that sense, they're useless, but I think you actually can see the remainders of these ligaments in a person's body after birth. But they shrivel up and they no longer carry blood because there's nowhere for them to go. Okay, can you briefly explain what coronary circulation is? It's just the name for the blood vessels that are within the heart, that are transporting the oxygenated blood, coronary arteries, capillaries to the specific cells, coronary veins, carrying the blood away back to the vena cava, just like any other vein in your body. Okay, so it's just a special name because coronary circulation is so important in the context of thinking about heart disease and that sort of thing. Right? So there's a term coronary artery disease that we use to describe heart disease. Okay? So it just has its own little name. We gave it the name, right? Because it's kind of its own little system. But again, functionally, it's not really different than the circulation in any other part of your body. What prevents mother's blood from reaching fetus? Because the mother's blood, there is no tube, for lack of a better term, that goes directly from mother's blood to fetus. When the mother's blood gets to the placenta, and again, I think you need to look at a picture of this to really understand it. When the mother's blood gets to the placenta, it washes around in this chamber. And actually, I'm going to be showing you guys a video of this after break. But it literally just swooshes around in this chamber. And inside the chamber are these villi. Inside of the villi are the capillaries of the baby, but they're trapped inside the villi. So this blood is swooshing around here, and molecules can diffuse from this blood through the cells that line the villi into the capillaries. So there's kind of a bunch of cells in between the mother's blood and the baby's blood, right? So that's why we say the mother's blood doesn't go to the fetus. But molecules from her blood can diffuse across these layers of the placenta and then enter the fetus's blood and go into the fetus's body. Okay, but again, I think it would be helpful to see a picture of that. Is simple diffusion happening between the mother's blood and the fetus's blood? For sure, yes. Now, when you ask that, it makes me think, well, is there also facilitated diffusion? I have no idea. That's a fascinating question. I would say probably, because I would think there'd be things that have to travel through that can't go through simple diffusion. So, like glucose can't go through simple diffusion. So, yes, there's got to be some facilitated diffusion too. Interesting. Never thought about it that way. Thanks for asking. Is the diaphragm a smooth or a skeletal muscle? Such a good. You guys are asking such good questions. Okay, it is a skeletal muscle, Gian. You know why? Because it's attached to your ribs. Okay, so it's technically a skeletal muscle. Most skeletal muscles are for your arms and legs, but it is technically skeletal because it's attached to your skeleton, which means it's pulling on bones. Right? That's what skeletal muscles do. Smooth muscles don't pull on bones. Smooth muscles, somehow push on soft things. Right? So they're usually around things like your stomach, your blood vessel. So that way when they contract, they can squeeze, right? But they're not pulling on bone to make motion happen in the way that it does in your arms or your legs or your diaphragm. Ting is asking, what is a good description of a stroke? So, of course, it depends what kind of stroke you're talking about. Remember, there's ischemic and hemorrhagic, right? Both of them, though, the term stroke is what we use for the brain, okay? So you can have an ischemic stroke where a blood clot blocks a vessel in the brain, therefore blocking blood flow, not enough oxygen to those tissues. Hemorrhagic stroke, a blood vessel leaking or bursting, right? Same effect in the sense that blood is now not getting to the places where it needed to go to get to those cells, but you have additional damage that's caused from this burst blood vessel and from the blood that's now flowing in the brain, okay? But the term stroke can refer to either one, but it always refers to the brain. Well, it's used in some other contexts like heat stroke, but let's not get into that. Also, the difference between a vessel and a vein. So vessel is super general. We say blood vessels to mean arteries, arterioles, veins, venules, capillaries, any sort of tube carrying blood. Vessel can even be lymphatic vessels, tubes carrying lymph, right? Vein is a very specific term, meaning the blood vessels that return to the heart, right? So once you have capillaries and that blood is returning to the heart, all those vessels returning to the heart are veins. Similarly, blood vessels going away from the heart are all called arteries. Okay, arteries away. Victor, what are the most important things to remember about diffusion of biomolecules across the placenta? What are the main biomolecules that can or can't pass through? You know, if it helps, think of it like your intestines. You know that in your intestines, only the smaller biomolecules can diffuse through, right? Because that's how diffusion works, right? So if it helps, think of it that way. Whole proteins are not going to diffuse through, right? It's not quite that simple because I know that some small antibodies can, and I don't know the exact mechanism for that. But generally speaking, diffusion is often a function of size. So I would say the size is going to matter, but also some of the chemical composition in the sense that, you know, this is living tissue, and it's going to allow some things through and some things not. So there's going to be some things that are based on physical properties and some things that are based on what is your body, what are those cells allowing to go through, because that's their function, is to be selectively permeable. Okay, so it's similar to your intestines, if that's helpful. Morgan Freeman. Okay, wow, that'd be pretty amazing if Morgan Freeman was on my chat. What PowerPoints would be helpful to review for tomorrow? There's a few major ones. I would say certainly the respiratory one and the blood circulation immunity one. I feel like those are actually the only ones. I might be missing something, but I think those are the two main ones. And then you have the reading guides. You know, partly the reading guides are for you to practice the information with the PowerPoints, but they're also good references. So I guess you could decide what is helpful. The nice thing about the reading guides is there's entire sentences spelling out ideas as opposed to the PowerPoints where it's more bullet points, right? Although my PowerPoints tend to have a lot of sentences. Sorry about that. But for some people, having those sentences might be helpful. If you really wanted to get the full shebang, you could have the PowerPoint and the reading guide and kind of have those next to each other. Over time, of course, I'm encouraging you to get that stuff in your own words on your study guide, because ultimately, come final exams, you really don't want to look at like 15 PowerPoints, right? So continue to think about consolidating information as you learn it in your own words and connecting across these different PowerPoints so that, you know, you can understand it better, remember it better, and answer more complex questions. How do memory lymphocytes work? Does the body create new cells that are memory lymphocytes or make existing ones? Oh, that's an interesting question. I think they're existing ones. They're B cells. So the B cells, when they are activated to fight a particular pathogen, some of them differentiate into the plasma cells that produce antibodies, and some of them differentiate into memory B cells. So I think they're B cells that already existed that matched that pathogen. One of the first things that happens is the B cells make a lot of copies. And then some of them are going to be becoming memory cells in the way that some of them can become plasma cells. Okay, sorry, I'm looking at a message on my phone as well. Okay, so I can go for a little bit longer, but just as a time thing, man, it's 10 o'clock, okay? So I don't want to keep you guys up too late. We all need to get some sleep. Remember how important sleep is before a test, okay? You will perform better on a test with getting some sleep. So I think we're going to close it off pretty soon. Let me take a quick look to see the messages that are left. Deoxygenated from the baby to the placenta. Yes, more or less, Ting, that's correct. Oh yeah, that's interesting about does your body attack the memory cells? I've never heard of that being a problem. So your body must because your body is the ones that would attack are your lymphocytes, right? So the lymphocytes must know not to attack the lymphocytes that are already memory cells. Interesting question. I don't know how they know that, but I would assume yes, they need to know that. You're welcome, TakeQ. Thanks for staying on so long. Yeah, you guys are hardcore. Um, I'm glad you feel ready. Awesome. You guys are doing great. Don't worry about it. If you're here working this hard, I'm not too worried, okay? Ah, Siri. Yeah, sometimes people do overcomplicate. Okay, generally I'm not trying to necessarily make it too complicated, but sometimes biology is complicated. You know that. You're welcome. Can you explain acquired immunity? So the term acquired just means not innate. Innate means inside. That means I had an immune response because I got sick or I had a vaccine. Acquired means it came from somewhere else. I acquired it, maybe because I'm a fetus and I got it from the mother or somebody transplanted antibodies. For practical purpose, know that innate immunity is much stronger than acquired, right? Innate immunity is the way to go. You want to have your own immune response. It's way more effective, okay? You're welcome. Me too. Me too. Thanks, you guys, for coming on. Thanks for caring so much. I really appreciate it. I'm glad it was helpful, and we'll come up with some more cool things to do. Okay? You guys have a good night. Sleep well, okay? Get some good rest, and don't worry about it, okay? You're going to do fine. Have a good night. I'm going to sign off. Bye-bye.